So yeah, hello once again. Thank you for having me a second time. It's a great honor to be able to participate in two panels. Uh, for the next couple of minutes, I'd like to talk about the impact of the Temporary Agency Directive on posted workers, particularly on the question of permanent assignments and whether or not they are prohibited by the directive or not. Why am I speaking about such a question? Whenever we have like an employment relationship that has a connection to at least two or even more countries, the question arises what kind of law, especially labor or employment law, is applicable. And that question is EU law regulated within the Rome 1 regulation. You know, it's a civil contract, employment contract, particularly regulated in Article 8 of that regulation. And in essence, I put the provision there, but in essence, it actually says, well, at first you can pick the law that you want to apply. There are some restrictions. You can't circumvent the legally applicable labor law, but basically you can choose your own. If you don't, it's the law that you typically work at the country you're working at or from which you're working. And what is of particular interest, that the applicable law does not change if you temporarily work at another country, right? This is exactly that the Rome 1 regulation is impartial to posting of workers, which is also confirmed when you look at Article 23 of the Rome 1 regulation, because it says, I'm sticking with the usual habitual working space, but if there is some special regulation that has something to say about the applicable law, well, then that applies as some sort of lex specialis. And well, this provision is the posting directive, right? Because the posting directive is applicable to like posting undertakings, those that post workers somewhere else, and which is quite interesting. And now you can see how the two topics are intertwined with each other. And temporary agency, a temporary workers agency or temporary employment undertaking is an undertaking that posts workers in some scenarios like across the borders. And after some time, particularly 12 months, it states that all of the laws of the hosting state are applicable on the employment relationship. Although regarding Article 8 of the Rome 1 regulation, it stays with the original one. The question that I'm looking at right now is that temporary agency workers are posted workers, and the posting directive somehow seems to think it is possible that they are in a hosting state for more than 12 months, because then the consequence would be that the hosting state laws apply. However, the temporary agency directive speaks of temporary agency work as being temporarily. And while the terminology in the Rome 1 regulation is as long as you have the will to come back, it's temporarily, the same cannot safely be said for the temporary agency directive. When the directive came into force, the German legislator, for example, he thought that the temporary agency directive would prohibit permanent assignments or assignments that exceed a certain duration. And in 2011, he actually implemented a statement that said temporary agency work directive, temporary agency work has to be temporarily. And a couple of years later, he implemented a maximum duration of 18 months. However, the Austrian legislator was not really startled by the use of the word temporarily in the directive. Actually, we implemented a provision that said after 4 years, you still have to, make some certain measures. With this, the Austrian legislator shows that he thought several years of temporary agency work are possible. So this is like a dispute between Austrian and German scholars, like what is actually the standpoint of the temporary agency directive on permanent assignments. What actually is that? Does it mean 1 year, 2 years, and so on? I'll go into case law in a little bit, then we'll see. But this is actually like the starting point of the question that is really interesting to me, because does the Temporary Agency Work Directive prohibit permanent assignments? One thing that I want to empathize, and that's the starting point of everything, the directive does not contain an explicit prohibition of permanent assignment. It just uses the word temporarily throughout the directive, like at the scope and at the definitions, but at no point there is actually a statement that says this sort of permanent temporary agency work is prohibited. Actually, the opposite is the case, because in Article 4 of the directive, it is stated that prohibitions and restrictions are only legal if there is some legitimate aim and if all of it is proportionate. And this brings me to the first case that I want to discuss, because obviously we're discussing a question of the interpretation of union law. Therefore, we'll always look at the case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union. And the first case was actually rather soon after the directive entered into force. It was just 2 years after. And it wasn't a question of whether or not long-term assignments are prohibited due to the directive, but it was the other way around. There was a finished general collective agreement from Finland, and this general collective agreement stated that the use of temporary agency workers was only permitted for a very short amount of time, only when they were substituting like regular workers, or if there was some sort of special job that needed to be done that could not be done by the permanent employees. And there was an undertaking in Finland that actually used temporary agency workers just like regular ones. They were employed permanently. They were posted there permanently. And the social partners of Finland, they said, well, this is illegal due to the agreement. The agreement forbids this. And the employer argued that the agreement was actually not in compliance with EU law, because Article 4 of the directive states that prohibitions and restrictions are only legitimate under certain conditions. So they decided, well, the Court of Justice will tell us what to do. And they actually just wanted to know, is the regulation under the general collective agreement in compliance with Article 4 of the directive or not? And the European Court of Justice actually made a surprising move. They said that Article 4 is only addressed at the authorities of the member states. So it's just like the legislator, which means that they actually have to check their regulation if it's compliant with union law or not. But the courts, for example, when deciding a case, they don't have to apply the regulation. So basically, the European Court of Justice said, even if the general collective agreement was in violation of EU law, the court could do nothing about it. It was not addressed at it. The authorities of the member state would have to check whether or not it's compliant and then adapt possibly. So therefore, they said, we don't really have to tell you anything because it doesn't change the outcome of the case. And then there was silence for a couple of years. The discussion continued. Not much could be deprived from the aforementioned case. And then the next one was an Italian case. It's JH versus KG. And it was like the completely opposite to the Finnish case, because the applicable law in this case, in the Italian one, did not have any restrictions at all. So due to the like unregulation of some sort of maximum amount of assignments or the maximum duration, it was possible that the employee in question, he was actually posted as a temporary agency worker for, I think, a little bit more than 2 years, due to many, successive contracts and extensions, right? Like he had 8 different contracts and 17 extensions, yeah. And since there was no prohibition, this was possible and legally under Italian law. However, the employee then claimed, well, this is a misuse of temporary agency work, because it clearly states it has to be temporarily. I've been here for 2 years. That's a permanent assignment. So the Italian court referred to the European Court of Justice once again, and they were looking at Article 5, paragraph 5 of the directive. I'm just going to put it up real quick. It basically says that the member states shall ensure some measures in order to prevent misuse by successive assignments. And he said, well, Italy did not do that because there were many successive assignments and the member state doesn't say anything. They should have implemented some sort of maximum duration, some sort of maximum amount of successive assignments. This is not compliant with EU law. And the Italian court asked it as well. And the European Court of Justice said it's very openly framed or formulated the Article 5, number 5. So there's no specific measure that you have to implement. We don't tell you to put in a maximum duration or a maximum amount of successive assignments. It's quite similar with the fixed term directive, where there's also like some measures that you can take, but you don't really have to implement all of them or a specific one. However, national law is not in conformity with the directive if there's no measures at all, and if therefore it is possible to make a misuse of successive assignment. And the court basically summed it up that if the duration of the successive assignments in total exceeds a duration that is longer than what can be reasonably described as temporarily, that this is an indication for misuse. Then it states, and this is the most important part, that's the reason why I highlighted it, that successive assignments as a whole are very problematic because it circumvents the balance between flexibility of the undertaking and the security of the employee that the directive tries to enforce upon them, because the temporary agency worker, he doesn't know what happens after each fixed term assignment. And lastly, it says you can have some sort of objective explanation why you're doing it, but if you don't, and you have those unjustified successive assignments, and they take on for a very long time, then that's a misuse, and that must be forbidden for by national law, in this case, Italian law. Still, literature wasn't quite clear about what actually was said by that, whether or not this would only apply to successive fixed-term assignments, or if the statements of the law could also be extended to like one long-term assignment without any fixed term, like an indefinite one. And also, we didn't really even know what temporarily means now. It's just, talking about some sort of duration. Then we came to the Daimler case that actually exceeded the duration of the Italian one by far, because it was actually an assignment lasting for 55 months due to 18 extensions. That's around 4.5, almost 5 years. And the employee that was working at Daimler, he was actually at just a normal position. He was working in the engine assembly area. So that's like the job that all the permanent workers did as well. And he stated that and that's the funny thing, since the assignment lasted more than 1 year, let's remember the posting directive, since it lasted longer than 1 year, it was not temporary, and therefore should have been prohibited by the directive. Once again, they asked the European Court of Justice. It basically repeated everything it said in the Italian case, but it added that temporarily is referring to an amount of time. So it's like in years maybe, but how many years in particular is open for the courts to assess and to decide. And it says it depends on the individual circumstances of each case, but you have to look at the relevant circumstances, like what is typical in that sector of business, which means that if there is no duration by law, the courts have to assess on a case-by-case basis. It also emphasized once more that the real issue is with the successive assignments. So it didn't really make a statement about what would have been if it was just like one long-term assignment. It especially pointed out once more, the real issue is that due to the fixed-term temporary assignments, the worker never knows what happens afterwards. As a result, and we can go into deeper detail in the discussion, I would argue that the analysis of the case law of the European Union shows that EU law as a whole, but especially the temporary agency directive, does not basically in every case does not prohibit permanent assignments, but that it's the more misuse characteristic would be the successive assignments. Like many fixed-term contracts that we know from the fixed-term directive are also misuse, and the same should go for the fixed-term assignments, which means that only if you can't justify the successive assignments and then exceed due to an accommodation and duration that is longer than what can considered to be temporarily, which once again has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, then this would be a misuse and this would be prohibited. However, like one long-term assignment that's for an indefinite amount of time, I don't think it's prohibited by EU law or the Temporary Agency Directive. Thank you.
Thank you, Konrad.